All right, how's it going, everyone? My name is Sam Welker. This is Cosmic Sandbox, and today we're going to be jumping in to Cinema 4D and exploring the Octane plugin a little bit further. Recently, I was doing some cloud rendering in Octane, and I had a little bit of difficulty understanding some of the settings. And I read through the documentation, did some studying, did some tests, and I figured it'd be really helpful to make a video and explain this for others. Hopefully, helping you to get a better understanding of how to create materials or volumes in Octane. So there's a lot of settings we're going to go through, and we've got them all prepared here. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, today I'm going to be using some volumes from the CloudKit, from the CloudKit 2, which is available on our Gumroad. You can find a link in the description if you are purchasing it early, closer to the release of this video. There is a coupon code in the description you can use, get 10% off. It is a set of 1,800 VDB files. So you have 900 unique different clouds in two separate resolutions. You've got 300 by 300 by 300 roughly, up to something like 700 by 700 by 700. So some of them are more like 650, some of them are 700, some of them go as low as like 250. It depends on the scale of the cloud. But anyways, the important part is that there are 85 gigabytes of clouds. So if you need something, this basically covers every single possible need you could have. So, and I think it's a pretty fair, reasonable price for freelancers and artists that want to get started. So, yeah. Anyways, that is the pitch there. That is what we're going to be using. And I wanted to show you the lighting setup as well. This is something, I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but this is very convenient. When you're using Octane, you can have your HDRI. And I'm just using an HDRI from the Octane Studio Kit, which was created some years ago by me for, I think, Particle. And we're going to be re-releasing that soon, but this is an HDRI from that. And then also we have a visible environment. So if you look at the difference here, you've got the HDRI environment. And I've turned the power from 1 to 10 just to really boost the lighting. And then I've got a visible environment. You can see primary environment and visible environment are here. And what I'm using here is basically these two separate options. This is what is creating the light, the HDRI. This is what's lighting the clouds. And then the visible environment is what you actually see. So if we open up the live viewer, we can go ahead and hit render. And you can see, if we rotate around, this is a live update, whether you can tell or not, there is literally nothing in here besides, these two environments and the cube. And you can, see the environment if you hide this, and it's really blown out with the lighting currently. But yeah, it helps with the clouds a little bit. So anyways, that is how I've set up this lighting environment. So let's go ahead and take a peek at these clouds. So we're going to start out with a VDB file, right? So what I've got is I've got the VDB file, and you can see I've got the CloudKit here. This is what happens when you download the CloudKit. You've got these 4 different folders of different types of clouds, and then you've got the CloudKit 1 available as well, which also has 4 folders. Then you've got all these preview files in here. You can just open these up in an image viewer and select the cloud puff you want. Very convenient. In this case, we're going to go ahead and skip that. I've already done that. We've got Cloud 11 in the CloudKit, and then I've pulled it in using the import unit. And if we turn this on, it's going to take a moment because it's going to try to start rendering it as well. You can see if we open up the live viewer. And it is using hectometers. So normally when it comes in, it will default to meters. Let me go ahead and pause the renderer so you don't see it, or so it doesn't delay. And you can see meters is fairly small in this case. Probably a portion of that is because these clouds were created using Houdini. And normally Houdini has a 1/100th scale compared to Cinema 4D for this kind of stuff. So anyways, hectometers gives us a, 100x scale, and it gives us a nice, starting point, next to the 2-meter cube. This is the size of the cloud. And basically, when you pull this in, you've got, the density auto mapped. It's very convenient. And then we've got the volume medium. This is, I believe, the exact material that you get by default. If you need a new material put in, you can just click fog or fire. I'm going to click fog. In this case, it just gives you kind of the default settings. And it's, two different areas for clouds or for volumes, smoke, things like that you're really going to want to focus on. Oh, excuse me. There is the absorption and scattering, which we'll talk about. And then if you want to use something like fire or something kind of like a nebula or, something kind of abstract, emission can also be very useful. I'm not going to be covering displacement in this video, by the way. That is something that we can cover in another video if it is requested, but I don't tend to use that. So we're going to end up skipping that in this case. Plus, I think the clouds, have plenty of displacement as is. So anyways, this is the VDB when it comes in, and let's go ahead and take a peek. Let's render it. And remember that HDRI that we have set up is what is lighting this. So this is, with the HDRI cranked to 10 for the lighting. And this is what the cloud looks like when it is brought in. Let's go ahead and rotate around. You can see it's rendering fairly quickly. That is due to the step length being set to 4. Obviously, this doesn't look very good. It looks kind of weird. It has this kind of roll-off, effect where you can see darker parts directly, and then the sides look a little bit more, a little bit brighter. It's kind of a weird material, but we'll go ahead and look at the material settings to tweak that. All right, let me go ahead and save in case it crashes, and then we're going to turn on these 3 options here. And actually, on that note, let me go ahead and offset these. I offset most of them. Kind of forgot to offset this one. All right. So this is what I was talking about with the material settings. You can see they start to look a little bit better once you start to tweak them. This is the density and the step length. So, and it varies. In this case, we've got the far left one over here. The density is at 100 and the volume step length is at 4. And the absorption and scattering are still the same. You can see it's still at 0.2 for the absorption, 0.5 for scattering. So those don't really matter. The middle one is set to a density of 1, which looks a lot cleaner. And then we get down to the third one on the right here. This is using a volume step length of 0.1. So you can see that the volume step length does something really interesting here. Let me zoom in. If you look at these 2 clouds here, you can see, and I'm actually going to change the step, or no, it's already there. Okay. I was going to say I'm going to change the step length from 4 to, or from 1 to 4, but the middle one's already set to 4. You can see kind of right here that there's a little bit more detail in this cloud than in this cloud. It's a little bit hard to see, but the volume step length takes into account the resolution. So that's going to give you more detail by lowering this. This is basically saying hey, here's your VDB. How much should we ray march through the VDB cloud to calculate the lighting? Ray marching is basically like path tracing or ray tracing. It's where it moves through the VDB volume, and then it just calculates the lighting and the material. So anyways, this is the resolution at which it renders the cloud inside of the cloud. So you get a lot more detail. And here, you can see these 2 are the same density. This cloud has a significant increase in detail and in lighting detail. So it gives a much nicer view. So 0.1 is a good starting point. You can bring that down a lot lower. For these clouds, you'll want to use something more like 0.01 in the final result if you can, justify the render time. However, you want to balance render time and resolution. Because if you really lower volume step length a lot to 0.001, you're going to have several hour renderings per frame, especially if you're using multiple VDBs, complicated lighting, geometry, all of that, and trying to get rid of all the noise. And when you have something like this, denoising can be useful. You can denoise a volume. Let me see if I can find the settings for that. All right. So if you go into the camera imager settings and the denoiser, you can increase or you can enable denoising and use that on volumes. However, you will lose detail. So you got to be a little careful with balancing all of that information. So anyways, let's go ahead and take a peek again. These are the 3 different samples here. We have the high density with high volume step length on the left. And we've got the low density with low volume step length in the middle. And then we've got the high or the low density and low volume step length on the right. So same volume step length on these 2. And then let's take a peek at what this volume on the left with high density would look like if we were to set it to the same volume step as the right. You can see it gets a lot crisper, a lot more detailed. And to be frank, it looks kind of terrible because it's really dense. But that is okay because we can easily tweak those values. So that is the density and step length. In a nutshell, basically the density is how thick the cloud is and the how much lighting it lets through. And the volume step length is the resolution the materials are calculated at, which also affects the absorption scattering. So we'll go ahead and look at those. Let's also talk a little bit about that before we wrap up here, actually, because that's why this is calculating this way. In this case, we have a lower absorption value and a higher scattering value. Scattering is like the reflection. It's like the specularity, if you will, of the cloud. And as you turn up the scattering, you're going to have more light collected. It's going to scatter and collect in the volume. The absorption is more like subsurface scattering. It's like the refraction or transparency, if you will. And that is, as you turn that up, you're going to have a darker cloud. As you turn it down, you will have a darker cloud. And that's when the invert absorption is checked on. If you uncheck invert absorption, let's actually do this on all of them. If you uncheck it and have a low value, you're going to get no absorption. It's not going to absorb the light. But if you turn it all the way up, it's going to absorb the light and you're going to have a denser result. So if we check the absorption box, you can see a value of 1 gives you a very bright cloud. It's not absorbing any of the light. It is just letting it all pass through. It's all just scattering. If you turn that down, you're going to get a more realistic result. So it depends on your objective, though. It really is worth playing with this value. So again, we'll talk about that in absorption and scattering more. But that is the volume step length a little bit more explained. Basically, again, the resolution of going through creates more scattering because there's more scattering happening. There's more resolution. So it creates a brighter cloud in this particular situation. So that is why that got brighter. All right, let's go ahead and take a peek at absorption and scattering. We've got 4 separate clouds here, and we're going to look at the different settings. So this is already something we covered a little bit in the last area. But let's go ahead and take a peek at these. So all of these clouds have a density and a volume step length of 1, so they render quickly. You can see we've got a kind of transparent puff here. We've got a bright puff here. Let me turn down the brightness of the HDRI so it looks a little bit cleaner. All right, so kind of a see-through, foggy cloud, something a little bit more, dense and a little bit brighter, something a little bit more like some smoke, and then some kind of like Dementor smoke kind of thing from Harry Potter. So let's take a peek at these. So we've got these, let me make this kind of small. We've got these 4 different volumes here. We've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see over there which one is selected. Let me move these over so you can see. All right. And then we'll put this right here. Okay. All right. So if we look at this first cloud, this is, again, the same density and same volume step length on all of these. We have the first cloud, we have a high absorption value and a low scattering value. In this case, I'm just going to drop this down to like 0.01. This is with absorption high with the check mark checked. And the scattering low. This is not very reflective. You can see it's not very bright. It just takes the lighting and passes it through, right? The next cloud is both of them at maxed values. They're both at 1. And this is what it looks like when you have both of them at a brighter value. Again, this is a lot of bright light coming through, and with the invert absorption, it's letting a lot of light through. So let's take a peek at what that looks like when we take the absorption value and turn it down. So this is, comparing the light not absorbing, not, holding it back, not cutting it off, but instead letting it just pass through and just come through and scatter a lot. That's what this bottom right cloud is. Top left, in this case, or back left, is when we use a lower absorption value, and this is what basically cuts off all the lighting, and it basically, makes it a lot darker. So, and then the last option is the 0.01 on both of these. We'll go ahead and use. I just manually cranked them down, but this is a darker version. So if we take the visible environment and we turn up the brightness on this, you can see This is great if you want to create like a dark puffy smoke. Also, this is very helpful to have this background environment going up because you can also see when you turn this up, this cloud in the back looks very bright right now. But if we turn this up, you can actually see it's very dark. And the bottom right cloud with the scattering is very bright. So, it's good to tune these materials in their final setting. By the way, quick note on that. But yeah, if you wanted some kind of dark Dementor smoke, this may be a good option, maybe with a little more scattering, because scattering kind of gives more of that micro detail, helps you to see it. But anyways, those are the different settings you can use with absorption and scattering. And you want to basically tweak these to kind of get the right vibe. Again, absorption is light cutting off through, it's kind of like the subsurface scattering. And scattering is like the specularity or the reflectivity inside of each, water droplet in the cloud, if you will. So let's go ahead and turn these off, and we're going to move on to scattering phase. So this is a little bit of a different setting here. This is one of the ones that I didn't quite understand well before. And I looked through the settings, and it's a little bit difficult still to completely understand it for me. But I believe it's basically like density. But it's like a material density instead of a volume density in a way. So it's about, I guess it's like the density for the scattering. You can see that with the center cloud, which has a scattering value at default, the scattering phase is at default. Basically, it is, transparent. You can see through it. On the right side and the left side, it is at -1 and 1. And this plays with the density quite nicely, but you can't really tell here. So let's go ahead and turn this back down. All right, so I took just a moment to just verify these settings and checked the documentation again. I think I was correct here. The higher scattering phase is in fact going to create a denser vibe. I just had to turn down the volume step length for it to really come through. For some reason at the lower step length, it just didn't have enough resolution to calculate this. But you can see as we move from the full scattering phase to neutral scattering phase to negative scattering phase, which is these three, it becomes more transparent. And you can check the Octane documentation to see more reference on this. This is their reference. But yeah, as you tweak these values, let's go with the middle one. As you pull it up, you're going to get a denser, darker cloud. And as you pull it down, you're going to get more of a see-through transparent option. And again, this is only affecting the scattering. So if you want to affect the general density overall, you need to affect the density of the cloud or the mapping out here, which we'll talk about later. So that is the scattering phase. Apologies if that was a little confusing at first. The volume step length was throwing me off. But again, that is the correct settings for changing the density. Basically, you pull this down or up depending on how much you want the scattering to be dense and dark. So if you want a dark, stormy cloud, more scattering. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the volume gradient. This is where things get kind of fun and interesting. I think they're fun and interesting before, but this is the volume gradient. So what you can do with this, and let's take a peek at these settings. They are varied based on the RGB spectrum of absorption. In this case, I believe everything else is the same. This just gives you kind of a variety to look at. And then I'm going to turn up the density in this case and turn this HDRI back up. There, that'll be good. Okay. So these are three different clouds. It's basically the same concept. I'm just showing some varying absorption values so you can kind of get a little bit more of an idea there. But the volume gradient is a gradient that is using the density of the cloud, in this case, to map color. So this is the color of the scattering. You can do this with the absorption as well. In this case, we're just using the scattering. And we are calculating this, this color map through the density portion of the cloud. So any portion of the cloud that is more dense and has a higher compacted mass of cloud basically will calculate further to the right, and anything less dense up to the point where it's just an empty voxel is on the left. So that's how you can get these nice colorful variations we can just add another tick in here and then get a different color. And that looks like a brain scan. But yeah, it's fun to play with, and you can get some really neat results with that. And we'll actually look at maybe a more practical use in the VDB mapping scale section. So this is how you set that up. You go ahead and you take your cloud, and then you go to the scattering ramp, which by default, let's go ahead and copy this shader, looks like this. And this is just the cloud as is, with a volume step length of 0.1, density 1, and just some default, or actually 0.5 on the absorption and 1 on the scattering. And I think it looks really good. I think this would be a very suitable cloud. I like it with the lighting. But let's go ahead and give a volume gradient in to the scattering ramp section. Now this changes things. You can see just right off the bat, it looks different. We can change it to cubic. We can change it to constant. Constant does not look great right now, but we'll explore that more in a second. But this is where you change the color settings. So let's use red, green, and blue. All right, and you can see that this does calculate all the way down to the very last bit of the VDB, and it does not fill the transparent areas, which is nice. If it did, that would not be very usable. But yeah, so this is the cubic interpolation. Here's linear. So you're going to get smoother. Cubic is more of an exponential curve. Linear is more of a linear curve, like so. You can see this is let's do this. Let's create a second one of these and pull it out. And we'll have one on cubic and one on linear. And what you'll see is just a higher contrast where the reds are a little bit less visible and the blues are a little bit more visible, and it creates kind of a bit more of an intense curve in this case. And what we'll do is we'll go into the scattering values, or the volume gradient for both of these, and we can actually change the interpolation of it. So if we turn the max value down, you can see there's a lot of red, and then it gets into a little green and a little blue, or we can turn it all the way up to 100 and it's mostly blue, a little green, and then somewhere in there would be red. So that is how you tweak the color values. Volume gradients are super fun if you're creating like a space nebula or something kind of sci-fi or abstract. You can do some really cool stuff with this. But also if you're creating some kind of like, fantasy pink cloud, like, in, kind of a light, like cotton candy environment, if you will. This is kind of how you could do that. You could just pick some nice colors that work well with that and tweak these settings. And you can see, the difference here is, basically just cubic and linear on the scattering interpolation between these two, and you get just kind of a little bit of a different take there. I think cubic is a little bit more realistic, but linear can be a little bit more fine-tuned control. So this is also a good time to look at linear versus constant. The constant is more like hard capped at certain density points, I believe. Though I'm not 100% certain. We'll go ahead and set this to something like 5 and take a peek. And it looks like, as it calculates, it does have some harder edges in here. So it looks like it is, in fact, kind of hard capping at certain values. You can see if you want to get something a little bit more, more lines in the area, a little bit more intensity in that form. This is, or a little bit more, definitive shapes. Constant could be very useful for that. So that is the constant interpolation. All right, so we're going to go ahead and delete that and turn these off and move forward. So guys, real quick, I just want to say thank you for sticking with me through this video. I appreciate your time. I really hope this is helpful for you. And just real quick, I would appreciate it if you could consider subscribing if you guys think that this is a good video. I'd really like to continue creating stuff like this, and I want to create a lot of value for the community. Through Cinema 4D tutorials, Blender, Houdini, different things like that, just different art tutorials. So, and then let me know in a comment below, if this has been helpful and what kind of stuff you'd like to see moving forward. And if it's helpful, again, the like button is always there. But guys, yeah, thank you for sticking with me. Let's go ahead and take a peek at the VDB mapping scales. So here we have a cloud with one in the absorption, one in the specular, and then we've got this simple kind of iceberg-ish kind of interpolation or gradient, excuse me, in the volume gradient. We get this nice cold cloud here. I think it looks super cool. And we've got a very low step length, by the way. And step length will affect this, I believe. So let's go ahead. Yep. You can actually, it doesn't affect it as drastically as I thought, but density will affect it. So if we set this to something like 5, let's set this to 1 for now, versus something like 0.5, you can see, it maps, or it maps fairly similarly, but it really looks very different. So in this case, I'm going to set it to 0.1 and let's say 10 versus 1. Okay. So that gives us some details there. I accidentally turned this down, but this is where you would get a lot more detail. So let's go ahead and check the VDB itself. And you can see the VDB, when it comes in, is a very large file. It is 469 by 550 by 528. This is one of the smaller clouds. Some of them can range up to 700 in the higher resolution packs. In the standard or lower resolution, they can be a lot lower. That is, yeah, that's just information there. That's not actually super relevant to this. But when you contain all of this information, it can be nice to have a global way to turn down some of these settings, some of the intensity. So if we wanted to, say, set the absorption mapping lower, you can change that instead of having to tweak it in here. And like, if you find the values in here just not really working to your liking, you can tweak the density scales in here. So in this case, this is what these settings look like, by the way, with the standard settings. But I found that 0.5 in the absorption mapping seems to look really good, and you get this nice crisp detail in here. So let's go ahead and leave that there. The density and scattering values can be tweaked and adjusted depending on what you're going for. Turning this up just gives it kind of more of a frosted look and kind of a little bit more of an intense. This actually almost looks more like effects from kind of a frozen cloud, if you will, kind of a iceberg-y look. And then if we set that to like 0.1, you'll see it is very dark. So the density mapping and scattering mapping, absorption mapping, these are very useful settings. And you can use that as well with the emission mapping settings. So let's go ahead and take a peek at the emission settings on that note. This is going to be the last thing we're going to cover. And this is not a fire. This is kind of like a space nebula kind of vibe. In this case, we're going to go ahead and turn down the density, take a peek at it. I've got the scattering and the absorption fairly low. Let's go ahead and take a peek at how we got this set up. So I've got the RGB spectrum for both scattering and absorption set to 0.01. We've got the volume step length set to 0.1 and the density to 1. And the emission is a texture emission. This is very important. The black body emission does not work here. I tried it earlier, didn't work. You got to use texture emission. And then you want to use the volume gradient. And this is where you get the real details. So if we were to say, copy this emission, or actually let's copy this volume medium. Let me click on fire. It'll just give us the default settings for fire. And with the lighting in the environment, of course, still cranked up super high, we're going to get that kind of frosted look around it. With the scattering, we can change these to a lower value to not get as much of that. And then, as you can see, this is pretty low resolution. There's not a lot of detail here. This is where we change the volume step length. So you can see, this is like the best representation of volume step length. This is a higher volume step length. This is lower, and then even lower. So you get a ton of detail. And let's change the density. Now, turning the density down makes it so it's harder to see all that detail because it's more transparent. So it's kind of like painting in Photoshop, if you've ever done that, the difference between a hard, completely transparent brush or putting some very light layers on with a very low opacity brush. You can get a lot of shading done that way, but it's all about fine-tuning your controls and utilizing them, just knowing what they do. So in this case, we're going to do a 0.01 and a 10 on the density so we can kind of see that detail. And we get this bright intensity here. Let's turn the power in the texture emission up. Let's do 10, 100, 1000. It's going to be way too bright. But that kind of gives you a representation of the brightness. And then, of course, you can change the brightness or max value on the volume gradient and tweak or basically scale the gradient mapping. So if you want it to be closer to the bottom of the gradient, you can just pull it up. If you want it to be closer to the top of the gradient, you pull it down. I think the 35 was a nice middle value, somewhere between 20 and 30. Or 25 and 35, somewhere right between there. So 30 looks really good. And this is how you can get a nice VDB, or excuse me, a nice smoke fire rendering. So if you're working with Turbulence FD, or if you're working with Embergen or Houdini, or I believe X Particles also has a fire and smoke simulation that you can use with Octane. These settings are how you can tweak those fire settings to get these really nice results. So let's go ahead and go back to the other volume medium that I had before and take a peek at this. So this again is how you tweak max value, and you can get these nice VDB kind of volume samples to get this kind of like, you know, nebula effect. And if you wanted to create something like a space nebula, you could basically tweak some of these settings in here and add some like, you know, little rings here of color. Let's tweak these settings, and you can get some like really cool, you know, nebula looks. And that is very close to what you'd see with some like space nebula photos from NASA. And then we can just tweak this value here and get some really hard lines. I like it more with the softer lines like so. And then let's tweak the density. Set it to maybe 2. I think 1 was probably best. And then we can set like the volume step length, higher values, which actually looks really good in this case, or something like a lower value for more resolution. And in this case, I would like to have less density and emissive value without really losing too much detail. So I'm going to play with the mapping values here. That is not working. Let's set this to like 0.2 in the scattering, see what happens. It takes out some of the sparkly bits. And those should all disappear with time. And then you can see that the absorption does in fact actually affect the emissive value. So yeah, anyways, that is how you work with these values to create something like this. Something a little bit more of a nebula. And again, you can make some really cool stuff with this, the Cloud Kit or external VDBs, wherever you get them. You can make some really cool stuff with these settings. So guys, I think that's going to be it for the video. Hopefully this was really helpful for you. Again, my name is Sam Welker, and this is Cosmic Sandbox. Make sure to hit that like button below if this was helpful, and subscribe for more content. And again, very important, if you do want to pick up the Cloud Kit, make sure to use the discount code in the description when you purchase it, and you get 10% off, and you get access to over or nearly 2,000 cloud files, 1,800. And you get access to all of these clouds you see here, plus more. And they come in multiple resolutions, and the original Cloud Kit, which was very popular back in the day. So anyways, guys, thank you so much for jumping in and hanging out. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will gladly answer them. And if you noticed I said anything wrong, please absolutely let us know. I would love to know so that we can correct that, so everyone knows, everyone wins. And yeah, without further ado, have a fantastic day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.